Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remove that jacket. That insignia you're wearing is not authorized for civilian wear. In fact, I've never seen it before, which means you probably bought it at some knockoff surplus store to impress people. The young military police sergeant's voice was a blade of condescending certainty, sharp and loud in the humid North Carolina air. The crowd of families and soldiers waiting to get through the main gate of Fort Bragg fell into a tense, voyeuristic silence. They laughed, a nervous, scattered sound that pricked the heavy air. The woman, who looked to be in her early 50s with silver threaded through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of long days and longer nights, did not react. She stood with a stillness that was utterly at odds with the sergeant's aggressive posture, her gaze calm, her hands resting loosely at her sides. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable, as if he were a mildly interesting weather pattern. But when the four-star general's car slowed to a halt 100 yards away, the old soldier in the passenger seat didn't see a confused civilian or a pathetic imposter. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her stance as the sergeant approached, a blade-edge alignment of the feet, a lowering of the center of gravity, a readiness so deeply ingrained it was like breathing. The general saw a ghost he thought had vanished from the world 20 years ago. If you believe that true respect is earned in silence and proven through action, type competence in the comments below. The sergeant, whose name tag read Miller, puffed his chest out, a caricature of authority. He was young, barely 22, with the rigid righteousness of someone who has memorized every rule but understands none of them. To him, this woman was an open and shut case of stolen valor, a particularly offensive crime in a place like Fort Bragg, the very heart of the Special Operations universe. Her appearance confirmed his every prejudice. She wore worn jeans, a faded gray t-shirt, and a simple, unadorned leather jacket that looked like it had been through a war of its own. There was no uniform, no bearing, no hint of the military in her at all, save for the single, tiny, almost invisible pin on her lapel. It was a small metallic device, no larger than a dime, depicting a stylized raven with a key in its beak, all rendered in a muted, non-reflective bronze. It was the kind of thing one would barely notice, which to Miller was proof of its fraudulent nature. A real hero, he thought, would wear their medals proudly, not hide some fantasy insignia on a dusty old jacket. He felt a surge of protective pride for the uniform, for the men and women who bled for their decorations. He was defending their honor from this pretender. He took a step closer, his voice dropping into a menacing, theatrical whisper meant for everyone to hear. You know, we have a federal law for people like you. It's a crime to wear decorations you didn't earn. It's a slap in the face to every soldier on this post. The woman's eyes, a pale, clear blue, finally met his. There was no fear in them, no anger. There was nothing but a profound, unnerving calm. She didn't speak. Her silence was a vacuum, and Miller rushed to fill it with more words, more accusations, his insecurity manifesting as volume. Are you deaf? I said take off the jacket. We're going to have a little chat. He gestured to his partner, a younger MP who looked deeply uncomfortable with the public spectacle. Get the cuffs. The woman slowly, methodically, began to unbutton her jacket. Her movements were not those of a person surrendering. They were deliberate, efficient, each motion conserved, as if she were field stripping a weapon in the dark. The sun beat down on the asphalt, the air thick with the smell of pine and diesel fumes. In the distance, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a helicopter echoed across the base. The crowd watched, mesmerized by the quiet drama. They saw a loud, confident soldier and a silent, strange woman. They saw a clear case of right and wrong. They saw exactly what Sergeant Miller wanted them to see. They had no idea they were witnessing the caging of a storm. Suddenly, the mundane afternoon shattered. A piercing shriek of rubber on asphalt cut through the air, followed by the sickening crunch of metal. A civilian SUV, which had been waiting in the adjacent visitor's lane, had lurched forward, its engine roaring unnaturally. The driver, an elderly man, was slumped over the wheel, his face pale and slack. The vehicle, now driverless and accelerating, swerved violently, hopping the curb and careening directly towards a group of school children who were gathered by the visitor center, their bright T-shirts a mosaic of impending tragedy. Panic erupted. People screamed and scattered, a chaotic explosion of human fear. Miller froze for a critical half-second, his training and his arrogance colliding and leaving him mentally paralyzed. He fumbled for his radio, his mind racing through protocols that were never designed for this specific brand of horror. Dispatch, we have a runaway vehicle, civilian casualty, heading towards the visitor center, he yelled, his voice cracking. His partner drew his sidearm, a useless gesture against 2 tons of speeding steel. The world seemed to slow down, every detail magnified in the terrible, suspended moment before impact. The terrified faces of the children, the frantic, waving arms of their teacher, the inexorable path of the black SUV. It was in this vortex of chaos that the woman moved. She was no longer a quiet, middle-aged civilian. She became something else entirely, a creature of pure, instinctual purpose. Her eyes, which had been so calm, were now scanning, calculating, processing the scene with the speed of a supercomputer. She saw the angle of the vehicle, the slope of the grassy median, the position of a heavy concrete planter, and the location of a thick metal flagpole. She registered all in a single fluid thought. "Miller," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise like a surgeon's scalpel. It was a voice of absolute, unquestionable command. The fire extinguisher. "In my bag. Get it?" Miller, jolted from his stupor by the sheer authority in her tone, blinked. His mind was still catching up. What? The extinguisher? She didn't wait for his comprehension. With a movement so swift and precise it was almost invisible, she twisted her body. She was still being detained, not yet cuffed but cornered. She used Miller's own rigid body as a brace, planting a foot against his tactical vest and launching herself sideways. It wasn't a violent shove, but an act of perfect leverage, a redirection of energy. She flowed around him like water around a rock. She landed in a low crouch next to a large, rolling metal trash receptacle, the kind used for base beautification. The SUV was now less than 50 feet from the children, a roaring metal beast. The teacher was trying to pull them back, but they were frozen, small statues of terror. The woman didn't hesitate. She placed her hands on the heavy bin and pushed. Her body mechanics were flawless, every muscle group firing in perfect sequence. It was the technique of a weightlifter, the focused power of a martial artist. The heavy bin, which likely weighed over 300 pounds, slid forward, its wheels screeching in protest. She wasn't trying to stop the vehicle. She was a physicist, not a strongman. She was changing the equation. She angled the bin not into the direct path of the SUV, but towards its front driver's side wheel. The impact was not a cataclysmic crash, but a sharp, brutal, glancing blow. The sound was a deafening crang of metal on metal. The SUV's wheel, struck at that precise angle, was violently wrenched to the side. The vehicle's trajectory was instantly altered. It veered sharply away from the children, fishtailing wildly across the grass. It slammed sideways into the thick steel flagpole, the one she had already factored into her calculation. The pole bent with a groan, absorbing the vehicle's momentum. The SUV wrapped around it, its engine finally dying with a final, wheezing gasp. A cloud of steam hissed from the crumpled hood. Then a profound, deafening silence fell over the entire scene, broken only by the distant, indifferent thumping of the helicopter. Dust and grass settled slowly in the sunlight. The children were safe, untouched. The teacher was sobbing, clutching them tightly. Everyone, the MPs, the families, the soldiers, stared their mouths agape. They weren't looking at the wreck. They were all looking at the woman. She stood beside the dented trash bin, breathing calmly, her expression once again placid, as if she had done nothing more strenuous than pick up a piece of litter. Sergeant Miller stood frozen, his radio still clutched in his hand. The words he had been about to say died in his throat. The arrogance, the certainty, The self-righteousness had been scoured from him, leaving only a hollow, echoing void of disbelief. He looked at the impossible geometry of the scene, the path of the vehicle, the angle of the bin, the final resting place against the pole. It wasn't luck. It was a solution, a brutal, elegant, and terrifyingly precise solution to a problem he hadn't even had time to fully comprehend. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. "That's not possible." A heavy, polished black sedan with 4-star flags on its fenders had pulled silently to the curb during the chaos. The rear door opened and General Wallace emerged, his tall, imposing figure radiating an aura of command that silenced the remaining whispers. He was a man in his late 60s, with a face like a topographical map of every conflict since the Cold War. He ignored the wreck, he ignored the gawking crowd, and he ignored the trembling Sergeant Miller. His eyes were fixed on one person, the woman. He walked across the grass, his boots making no sound, his movements as deliberate and purposeful as hers had been. He stopped a few feet in front of her, his gaze sweeping over her, not with suspicion, but with a deep, profound, and sorrowful recognition. "Unlock her," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. He wasn't looking at Miller. He was looking at Miller's partner, the younger MP, who fumbled with his keys as if they were red-hot. Miller himself seemed incapable of movement, his mind still trying to reconcile the image of the unassuming middle-aged woman with a tactical savant who had just averted a massacre. The general waited patiently until the cuffs were removed. Then he turned his full attention to Sergeant Miller. The temperature at the main gate seemed to drop by 20 degrees. "Sergeant," General Wallace began, his voice a low rumble of controlled fury, "you have committed a catastrophic failure of judgment today. Not because you failed to stop that vehicle, but because you stood here in public and attempted to humiliate a living legend." He took a step closer to Miller, who visibly flinched. "You demanded to see her credentials. You accused her of crime. You, in your infinite wisdom, decided she was a fake." The general paused, letting the weight of his words settle on the young NCO. "Let me educate you, Sergeant, so that you and everyone else here understands what true service looks like." He turned back to the woman, his entire demeanor softening with a reverence that stunned the onlookers. He gestured to the small, bronze pin on her jacket. "You see this insignia, Miller? You said you'd never seen it before. You are correct. You haven't. Almost no one has. It's the unit pin for the 77th Special Projects Group, also known as the Librarians. They were never an official unit. They never had a line item in the budget. They were a ghost organization, a deniable asset under direct JSOC command, active from 1998 to 2012. Their job was to go to places we weren't, to solve problems that didn't officially exist, and to clean up messes that could never be acknowledged. The general's voice became a history lesson delivered with the force of a legal sentencing. He walked slowly around the woman, as if presenting a priceless artifact to a class of ignorant children. The librarians didn't kick in doors. They dismantled networks. They didn't win firefights. They prevented wars. They were analysts, engineers, psychologists, and quiet professionals of the highest possible caliber. They operated so far outside the conventional wire that they didn't wear uniforms. They didn't have ranks in the traditional sense. They had roles. They were the shadows that allowed the men in uniform to do their jobs safely. He stopped and looked directly at the woman. "This is Dr. Evelyn Reed, and her role was field librarian, which meant she was the one they sent in first. Alone, to map the human terrain, to identify the threats, to understand the culture, the politics, the physics of a problem before anyone else even knew the problem existed. The reason she saw that accident happening 3 seconds before you did, Sergeant, is because she spent 20 years in places like Bosnia, Yemen, and the Hindu Kush anticipating ambushes and IEDs. Her entire existence was predicated on seeing the pattern in the chaos. What you just witnessed wasn't a lucky shove. It was a threat assessment and neutralization executed in under 4 seconds. It was muscle memory for her. He let that sink in, his gaze sweeping across the now silent crowd. She holds 3 distinguished intelligence crosses, which you'll never see because the citations are classified above top secret. She has a PhD in cultural anthropology from Yale and another in mechanical engineering from MIT. She speaks 5 languages fluently, 2 of them dead. She is, without exaggeration, one of the primary architects of the counterinsurgency strategy that saved thousands of American lives. He turned back to Miller, his face hard as granite. And you, Sergeant, you put her in handcuffs because you didn't recognize her pin. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence filled with awe, with shame, with a dawning, horrified understanding of the mistake that had been made. General Wallace then did something that no one on that base had ever seen him do. He squared his shoulders, brought his heels together with a sharp click, and rendered a slow, perfect formal salute. Not to a fellow officer, but to the quiet woman in the worn leather jacket. "Dr. Reed," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mom, it is an honor to see you again. Welcome to Fort Bragg." The story of what happened to the main gate did not just spread, it detonated. It moved through the barracks, chow halls, and command posts with the speed of a signal flare. It was told over beers at the NCO club and whispered between pilots on the flight line. It became, almost instantly, a piece of modern military folklore. The narrative mutated and grew with each telling, embellishing the facts until Dr. Evelyn Reed became a mythical figure. In one version, she had disabled the SUV with a single, perfectly thrown rock. In another, she had calculated the trajectory of the crash down to the millimeter on a napkin she'd had in her pocket. The core of the story, however, remained unchanged. A young, arrogant MP had tried to bully a quiet, older woman for stolen valor, only to discover he had detained one of the most decorated and clandestine operatives in recent American history, a fact validated by a 4-star general salute. The incident became a powerful cautionary tale, a living parable about the danger of assumptions. The phrase, "Don't pull a Miller," entered the lexicon of the 82nd Airborne and Special Forces units, a shorthand for judging a book by its cover. For Sergeant Miller, the aftermath was a crucible. He was not discharged or demoted. General Wallace had insisted on a different kind of justice. Miller was formally reprimanded, but his real punishment was the quiet, knowing looks he received from his peers and the crushing weight of his own shame. He spent weeks in a state of deep self-recrimination, replaying the scene over and over in his mind. He remembered the condescension in his own voice, the smug certainty on his face, the casual cruelty of his public humiliation of Dr. Reed. He contrasted that with her profound, unshakable calm, her lack of ego, and the terrifying efficiency with which she had acted while he had frozen. It was a lesson more brutal than any disciplinary action. One afternoon, a week after the incident, he saw her. She was sitting on a bench near the post library, reading a book, looking for all the world like any other civilian family member visiting the base. His heart hammered in his chest. He knew he had to face her. With trembling hands and a dry mouth, he walked over and stood before her. "Ma'am," he began, his voice barely a whisper. She looked up from her book, her blue eyes as calm as he remembered. "Dr. Reed, I need to apologize. What I did, there's no excuse. I was arrogant. I was ignorant. And I was wrong. I am deeply, truly sorry for the disrespect I showed you." He stood there, fully expecting to be dismissed, or worse, to be met with the cold fury he deserved. Dr. Evelyn Reed closed her book, marking her page with a finger. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze analytical but not unkind. "You made an assumption based on incomplete data, Sergeant," she said, her voice soft. "It's a common tactical error. The most dangerous ones often are." She patted the empty space on the bench beside her. Hesitantly, he sat down. "You saw what you expected to see," she continued. "An older woman who didn't fit your profile of a warrior. You failed to observe the details. You focused on the jacket, but not the way I was standing. You heard my silence, but you didn't listen to what it was telling you." She turned to look at him directly. "Your pride was your blind spot. You were so eager to enforce a rule that you forgot to assess the situation. That hesitation, That half second you were frozen during the accident, that's what you should be focused on. Your apology is accepted, Sergeant Miller. But an apology is meaningless without a change in behavior. Learn from this. Learn to see the whole board, not just the piece in front of you. Observation is your greatest asset. Assumptions are a liability that will get you, or someone you're sworn to protect, killed. He could only nod, humbled to his very core. She had not only forgiven him, she had given him the single most important lesson of his career. In the weeks that followed, the legend of the incident was formalized. General Wallace ordered the security footage from the main gate to be edited into a training video. It was titled Observation versus Assumption, and it became mandatory viewing for every MP and, eventually, for NCOs across the entire installation. The video was stark and unsparing. It showed Miller's swaggering arrogance, the public humiliation, and then the stunning 4-second display of competence from Dr. Reed, followed by the general salute. The spot on the pavement where she had been detained, right next to the dented trash bin that had been left there as a memorial, became informally known as Reed's Point. It was a physical reminder that the most dangerous threats and the most formidable allies often come in the most unassuming packages. The story was no longer just gossip. It was now institutional doctrine, a permanent part of the base's culture. 2 years passed. The world turned, conflicts shifted, and soldiers deployed and returned. At the main gate of Fort Bragg, the atmosphere was different. The MPs were still sharp, still professional, but the swaggering arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful intensity. They treated every visitor with a baseline of professional respect, their eyes scanning not just for threats, but for details, for the subtle cues that might reveal a deeper story. A new private, fresh out of MP school, stood his first watch at the gate. He was nervous, eager to impress his squad leader, Sergeant Miller. Miller was a different man. The youthful arrogance had been burned away, replaced by a mature, thoughtful confidence. He was now one of the most respected NCOs in his company, known for his calm demeanor and his almost preternatural ability to de-escalate tense situations. As they checked IDs, Miller pointed to the now-famous dented trash bin standing near the guard shack. "You see that bin, Private?" he asked. "Yes, Sergeant. That's a monument," Miller said. "It's a reminder that what you see is only a fraction of what's real." And then he told the story. He told it not as a legend about some mythical super spy, but as a deeply personal account of his own greatest failure. He described his own prejudice, his own ego, and his own ignorance in unflinching detail. "I didn't see a person," Miller explained to the young private. "I saw a stereotype. I saw an old woman, and my brain shut down. I had a checklist in my head, and she didn't tick the boxes, so I dismissed her. I tried to make her small so I could feel big. And in doing so, I almost missed the most competent human being I have ever met in my life." He paused, looking out at the traffic flowing into the base. She never raised her voice. She never argued. She never tried to prove who she was. She just was. She waited, she watched, and when action was required, she acted. Her competence spoke for itself, louder than any insult I could ever yell. I learned more about being a soldier from that civilian woman in 30 seconds than I learned in my entire first year in the Army. He tapped the private's chest lightly. "So when you stand here, you check the ID, but you also see the person. You look at their hands. You watch their eyes. You listen to what they're not saying. Because you never, ever know who you're talking to. You could be talking to a hero. And the real ones never have to tell you." The legacy of that day was not about the single dramatic event. It was about the quiet, seismic shift it created in the culture of a place built on strength. It was a lesson that rippled outwards, carried by every soldier who heard the story. The tale of Dr. Evelyn Reed became a touchstone, a reminder that valor wasn't measured in the volume of one's voice or the shine on one's medals, but in the quiet, steady application of competence under pressure. It championed the idea that true worth is proven through action, not assertion, and that respect is a currency earned in the currency of deeds, not demanded by the insignia of rank. The story taught a generation of young soldiers to look past the surface, to value the silent professional over the loud braggart, and to understand that the most profound strength is often the most humble. It became a part of the institutional soul of Fort Bragg, a narrative woven into the very fabric of its identity. A legacy isn't something you leave behind in a glass case for others to admire. A true legacy is what continues to move forward in the actions and beliefs of others. It is the lesson that survives the moment, the wisdom that is passed from a seasoned sergeant to a nervous private, the quiet understanding that the greatest weapon in any arsenal is a mind that is open, observant, and humble. Far away, in a quiet university town, a woman with silver-threaded hair and clear blue eyes sat on her porch, reading a book. She was unaware that her name had become a verb on a military base hundreds of miles away, or that a dented trash can have become a shrine to her quiet competence. She felt no need for the recognition. The children at the gate had been safe. The problem had been solved. For her, that was and always had been enough. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.